Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today, we're continuing our series on ethics of AI, going back to one of my absolute favorite childhood movies, WarGames. It's a movie from 1982, but a lot of the topics it gets into, everything from machine learning and how computers learn, to the way that we use games to learn from things, to the ethical questions involved around machines or humans making decisions, and the idea of treating warfare as a game. All of it continues to be deeply relevant for today. And it's a movie about my absolute first crush, so it's just a fun movie to talk about in general. And I just said that with the father of my wife, but fair enough. Anyway, all that and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Matthew Fox, your host. I've got a full team of people here today to talk about this movie. And so I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and start by the first question I'll ask you as you introduce yourself is, what did you know about this movie before we got started on this? So Paul, start with you.
Hi, I'm Paul Hoppy, aka Zen Madman. I had never seen this movie in its entirety until last night. I was very familiar with the premise of the film and even like probably the climax. Like, I think I probably watched the last 20 minutes of it 5 times on commercial television in the 80s, but I never actually saw the entirety of the movie as it came out in 1983, I believe, when I was like 5. So I didn't see it in the theater. And like, I watched a ton of movies as a kid, but like 40s movies and and like 60s
Fair.
movies, so I knew that it was about basically a kid who hacks into a government computer and like almost starts a nuclear war, and that's pretty much what the movie's about. Spoilers, I guess.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be talking mostly about the ethics of the AI, so it's not directly about the plot of the movie, but we will summarize the plot of the movie for those of you, probably most of you who haven't seen it, but if you haven't, I definitely recommend giving it a watch. I still think it's a great movie that holds up pretty well. Rob McKenzie, who has been on previous episodes, particularly about the ethics of AI.
Hi, I'm Rob McKenzie. So I'm the baby of this group. I was born in 1983, so this movie predates me. But I watched it probably 4-ish times as a kid. Like all of these tech movies that actually like felt like hacking. So like not the net, not hackers, but sneakers and war games, like feel like actual technology, right? They gloss things but they try to actually get a lot of it right. And those kinds of movies I loved as a kid. And so I watched this a bunch prior to this, and I rewatched it just on Monday. Nice. Or maybe Tuesday, earlier this week. And so I was very excited to get the chance to talk about WarGames because I adore this movie.
Awesome. Glad to hear that. And then our last guest, as mentioned, my father-in-law, Dan McCreary. Dan, I think of you basically as an AI guru. I think you have. I think you're going to build the Matrix, is my understanding. But I don't quite know it's you. But AI extraordinaire person Dan McCreary, say hello and introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. I have some distant memories of seeing this when I was in my 20s. Hadn't seen it for a long time, and I went back and did some research on it recently. And I was blown away about what a landmark movie this was. Yeah. I found out that this was the first time that the word firewall was ever mentioned in the context of security and public things. That Reagan saw the movie, and afterwards he asked his generals, is this possible? And they did a bunch of research, and they said, yeah, in fact, not only is this possible, but this could happen. So this was really an incredibly groundbreaking movie as far as the evolution of cyber security and cyber warfare and things like that. And I think we only appreciate it now looking back. When I first saw it, I just thought it was a fun kids movie. But now I really have appreciation for the research that was done behind it, and the stories that were put together about other things that had happened at the time, such as playing back a simulation of a war, which really did happen in data and production security systems. So it's a really fantastic movie to go back on, and it brings up a lot of key themes that are just as relevant today as when the movie came out.
Awesome. Well, and I had to laugh a bit when you said that about Reagan, because I mean, we're not going to talk about this part as much, but as far as like the movie to me feels like a very clear, deeply critical of the like kicking up of the Cold War that Reagan had done and bringing back the idea that nuclear war could be won. So, but he's also the person who thought Born in the USA was a patriotic song. So there you go. Let me go a quick summary. Go ahead.
I think the most important thing about before do the summary is the context, right? Yeah. You have to remember that in 1983, the wall in East Germany had not come down. We were in the middle of the Cold War, and there was still omnipresent fear of nuclear triggers going off. So before we tell it, I think it's context. Is everybody has to understand that when this movie was done, Cold War was the big major thing, and people were living in fear, constant fear of possible nuclear war. So with that, Matthew, I should let you take off and do the summary here.
No, I think that's really essential because, as you said, and it wasn't even just that it was the like constant of the last 40 years of the Cold War. It was that we'd had detente in the 70s, and there'd been some sort of idea of like, okay, maybe it's becoming less likely. And then a big part of Reagan's platform had been like, we can win a nuclear war. We can just have to outspend the Soviets and like build Star Wars, you know, the anti-missile systems and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, that's an essential part of this movie. So, and the plot of it is actually pretty simple. It's not a lot of twists and turns. It's mostly just about all the character and the computer and all that stuff that goes on. But the idea of it is that this kid in Seattle is trying to just have some fun. He finds out about a computer game factory producer that you might be able to sign into. He signs into their what he thinks is a computer game developer. It turns out that he's actually managed to sign into the NORAD computer. Because what has happened is that they did some missile tests. Humans refused to do the humans who were supposed to turn the keys to launch the missiles in simulated tests. Basically, we're like, I can't be responsible for 20 million deaths. I'm not going to do this. Go ahead.
I want to point out that's actually like the cold open of the movie. Is it is a unexplained test, right? It looks like they're going to war at the very opening of this movie. And so you hear the movie WarGames, you show up at this opening of the movie, and the first thing that happens is some people go down into a bunker and then have to get the order to turn the keys.
Yeah. I was watching it with a friend who said, like, immediately after that scene where you don't know what's happening, it cuts to something else and the music is kind of happy and peppy. And they messaged me, this does not sound like music of a nuclear war, because they fully believed it was happening. But so the point is that the military people then decide that they're going to install a computer called Whopper, War Operations Plan something. I don't remember the last one.
I think planning and response.
Yeah.
I think, exactly. That will take over the nuclear system to avoid the human error possibility. So our hero, our protagonist, accidentally signs into this thing, and it lists one of the games they can play is Global Thermonuclear War. So he thinks that sounds like a fun game to play, not realizing that he's getting the system to play the game because the system thinks that nuclear war, it thinks it hasn't been taught to think of war as war. It's basically been taught that when it takes over, it should play a game. So it starts to actually simulate war. Lots of tensions escalate. Lots of, chase scenes and the FBI trying to catch the kid and the kid turning into MacGyver to get away from the FBI. And he's got a partner named Jennifer who's with him for all of this. I appreciate her character a lot because she's not just there to look pretty and have him explain things to her. She's actually much more level-headed and kind of keeps him balanced, and they make a nice duo.
She has actual ethical considerations. He has no ethics over the course of the movie, basically.
Yeah. He realizes that a bunch of people are going to die, and that's bad. But he doesn't have the we see him as like he's a hacker in that he can screw around at school, hack into the system, and change the grades.
And she declines to have her grade changed at first,
Also context. I think today it's kind of hard to imagine this, but in the early 80s when this is written, unless you were a computer person, most of the characters in the movie don't understand computers at all. And there's a level of like, you watch them and you're like, why don't they understand? Like someone said, why would you lock the accused computer hacker in a room with a computer? And it's because, but yeah, I think it's accurate. The security guard would just not think that way. So anyway, they get to a situation where it seems like the machine is going to launch the missiles because it thinks it's playing the game. And in sort of the penultimate scene, the climax scene that Paul mentioned, they get the computer to play tic-tac-toe against itself. And because tic-tac-toe, basically it's impossible to win. And it goes through and it goes through and it goes through and it learns. And then it starts playing like quick simulations of thermonuclear war and learning that every time both sides get destroyed and there is no winner. And that's the kind of climax of the movie, is that the computer learns that you can't win the war. We shouldn't play this game. And then a line that I would have loved to see Paul Hoppy's reaction when it says this, basically the last line of the movie is, how about a nice game of chess? So that's the movie. And I want to just the opening question actually is one Paul suggested that I want to ask you all, and Rob, you especially, but I think everybody has some thoughts on this. Would you call this movie science fiction? And to what extent is or isn't it?
I think it's science fiction in the sense that they take a sound premise and extrapolate it, but realistic. Everything in the movie is very realistic, as Dan mentioned.
Right.
Like it's science fiction in that it's the 5 minutes into the future. What if we made a couple different choices? Cautionary tale kind of science fiction, which I mean exists. There's a lot of classic science fiction novels that are set just a little ways out from where they are, right? And so it's not different from any of those in kind, just in terms of like how ambitious it is, because most science fiction authors don't have access to NORAD, for instance.
Right.
And so it's the close range, we should probably be aware of this immediate threat science fiction.
Yeah, I would completely concur. I think science fiction is intended to make us think about our future options and potentially change our course and put in protective measures to make sure we don't have bad things happen to our little planet.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's funny because when Paul raised that question, my first thought was absolutely not, because I think of science fiction as allegory. That most of the time it's going to create a new situation with new kinds of people in a situation that's very different from our own, or at least somewhat different from our own, as a commentary on the real world situation. And this one is literally about the real world situation, as it said. But I think you all make a good point that it definitely can be pretty close to that. It definitely can be seen as that, because it's saying, let's play with the science a little bit and use that to ask questions about our situation.
Right.
Paul, what was your thoughts on it when you kind of raised the question?
Yeah, my thought was that in 1983, this movie was clearly science fiction insofar as the science, like the technology, was not yet there, right? But if you remade this movie shot for shot now, it wouldn't be science fiction because that technology more or less is here, right? I mean,
it's alternative history at that point,
yeah,
right?
You do have, computers that know not to split the infinitive and say the only move is not to play, like you do have computers that I'm sure there were these sorts of, game theory type things like running, right? Simulations, but the level of computing power that exists now, I think my guess would be closer to being able to do some of the things that were happening in the movie. But I'm not sure. Maybe that was sort of the level of, if you had, a supercomputer that took up a whole room, like maybe you could do that exactly. But my feeling is that the technology wasn't quite there yet, but it was sort of like, this is where it could go. And it's like, it did, right? I think is my impression anyway.
Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I just want to say my reaction to, a strange game. The only winning move is not to play. How about a nice game of chess? Was like, oh man, I wish I could have played a really good computer back in 1983 when a human could still beat a really good computer at chess. And now it's just hopeless.
Right.
Just no chance. Gonna get crushed.
Well, and I want to use that actually as a way to jump into talking about the AI in this movie, because I think one of the things that I think is fascinating is well, actually, let me back up a bit before I get into that. So Paul, I bring up chess and other games. You bring up a part of the AI that I really want to talk about in terms of game theory and learning and things like that, and the way a computer can sort of solve games. But before that, let's just kind of talk about the basics of it, especially from Rob and Dan, but also Paul. We've talked before about kind of like AI and different aspects of it. What's your take on this movie's portrayal of AI and kind of how accurate it is, and sort of what is it we're seeing in terms of those terms it's using, especially in terms of this idea of the machine learning?
I think it's a very good portrayal. The idea is that you have training data, you train those things, you build models, and then you execute those models, and hopefully the training set is representative of the real world. Yeah, it's right on. I don't see any problems with its process. I also see a pretty sophisticated idea of simulations of the world and doing things, and we have a part of AI called reinforcement learning nowadays, where we're effectively playing back certain games and seeing where we win and lose and changing our models based on that. So I think the terminology is much more consistent now, and the disciplines are consistent, but there's nothing in this movie that struck me as being incorrect about
Right.
AI and simulations and things.
Yeah, it isn't incorrect. I think that it's very science fictional in the sense that it's better than we had for technology at the time.
Right.
When you look at 1983, the hottest thing out there was the Cray 1, maybe, right? And that's got less power than a Fitbit nowadays, right?
Right.
Like, and so the power was not there. Like von Neumann, who invented games theory, I'm pretty sure that Peter Falcon is a reference to him, except like with reversed ethics, basically.
Okay.
And so like the big grandfather of game theory was also the big grandfather of computing, right? Von Neumann made a lot of the early computers. Yeah, von Neumann made a lot of the early computers, basically invented game theory from scratch. And the computing power that they show is a bit more than what a system in 1983 would have. And the actual principles that they used are like hand-waved. Someday we'll figure out how simulations work, how some of these game theory situations will work, which they didn't have perfect knowledge of all that stuff back at the time. But nowadays it's not even close to state of the art. It's just the way that things have been for a while in any kind of AI technology setting would be my read.
Well, in terms of that, so let's talk a little bit more, because I think I know those terms, but I'm not sure everybody does, and I have certainly level of refresher. So what exactly is meant by game theory?
So game theory is the study of basically action-driven systems. That's a bad description. Game theory is the study of how people interact in environments where they're manipulating resources. Is a very, very loose term of it. You have things like zero-sum games where there's no new resources, everybody's just exchanging things. You have positive-sum games where people can build resources by doing better. And figuring out what the optimal set of moves are to produce the desired outcome is the theory of games, of how to not just take your moves into account, but your opponent's potential moves. And it's a term that I've used a couple different times in our discussions is theory of mind. And game theory is a lot of building theory of mind. How do they think about the game so that you can figure out what their moves will be in the game? And game theory is a lot of building that in a controlled environment in a lot of cases.
Right.
Because most of the time it's applicable but not perfect for general outside environments in the world, because the world's much messier than figuring out the optimal bluffing strategy in poker is.
Yeah, I think the classic example of game theory is the prisoner's dilemma.
Yes.
Where four people are accused of a crime, and they're all put in separate rooms. And if none of them confess to the crime, they all get a very minor slap on the wrist. But if one of them turns the other in, then those other 3 people go to prison for a long time. And the question is, do they have a strong agreement? Do they have a mental model of each other,
Yep.
all not turning each other in?
Right.
And so you can't, if you don't have that theory of mind, you can't do that what if scenario. And so that's a really classic example of that
Yep.
game theory. And I think, it applies to nuclear war too. I mean, I'm going to press a button if I think that you're also going to press the button, right? But if I know you're not going to press the button, maybe I won't press that button. So
Right.
you have to have a mental model of what the other side is going to do to formulate your best action for the best outcomes.
Yep.
Mhm.
And von Neumann famously, actually, when they asked him, well, do you think we should launch a nuclear attack at the Soviets? He said, if you think you're going to launch it in an hour, why not launch it now? Right? He's like,
Mhm.
if you think that they will launch eventually, you should launch before them. So why not launch now?
Right.
And
Which is
yeah.
cold-blooded.
And that's like where you get to the sort of like, game theoretical solution of any game,
Mhm.
where,
Right.
I mean, mutually assured destruction is kind of like an example, right? Where it's like,
Yes,
if
absolutely.
if you know that they're going to fire back at you if you fire at them, then you can't fire. I mean, if your objective is to not get fired upon, right?
Right.
But on the other hand, if you know that they're going to fire on you eventually, but if you fire on them first, you'll preempt them from firing, then your optimal time to fire would be immediately, not taking into account any like ethical considerations,
Right.
but just like if it's like a win-lose kind of way you're looking at it. And like in poker, we are constantly talking about game theory optimal and like Nash equilibrium and optimal bluffing frequencies. There are objectively optimal bluffing frequencies for like based on what hands you have in your range, what hands you can have, what hands they can have. And that doesn't mean it's going to be optimal against the way a human makes decisions, but it does mean that a human can't, or anybody can't come up with some strategy that then keeps your strategy from being at least break even, basically. And so now we have these solvers that you can run and like it'll give you an answer. It won't be a perfect answer because you have to give it constraints that like, in poker, in like no limit hold'em, you can choose a whole bunch of bet sizes, right? So like our computers now, you have to give them a few bet sizes. And you're like, well, what if they only have these options? What if because you have to like kind of prune the game tree, right? And like if you're talking about a real world scenario, it's like that's a big game tree. Right.
Right.
So even when we're talking about poker, we're still building like these models that are not exactly representative of all of the options. But in a real world scenario, it's like it's going to be even more sort of reductive, right? But I guess the idea is to try and build a simulation or a model that is as representative as you can get to hopefully give you some result that's usable.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the concept of solver, because as you and I were talking about this, my comment that I think you agreed with was like, if the solver is a computer program that tries to figure out the game and figure out the optimal strategy, that's literally what the Whopper is. The Whopper is a solver for thermonuclear war.
Yeah, and they theoretically taught it a bunch of different games so that it would learn kind of strategy and logic, right? And then they teach it thermonuclear war. Right. And then they teach it tic-tac-toe, and it's like, oh, let's back off on this thermonuclear war thing.
Yeah. Well, so explain to me what, because I think that's the concept I think where a lot of people get lost. Not myself, certainly I understand all this. But I'm doing this for you, listener. No, I don't quite get this either. So what is machine? Because I think what I think about it is like you tell a computer every if-then statement of it, like you have to tell the computer at the end of the day all the different if-then statements that it then calculates. Clearly, machine learning is going in a direction. Like the computer is, like, it feels like it's kind of almost rewriting its programming or something. But what does that mean? This idea of machine learning, and in terms of the movie, what exactly is happening inside that computer?
Well, I'll jump in and try to make an explanation of this. That's my job. Actually, I try to explain what machine learning is every day to executives and healthcare people. And basically what it is that there's two worlds of making decisions. One is what's called deterministic logic. And deterministic means that given a input, the output is completely determined by a set of logic gates, in a sense, a set of true or false statements that can be evaluated. And if you put the same input in 10 times, you'll get the same output. And so it's very clear, it's very easy to understand, it's very easy to explain. Machine learning, on the other hand, is idea of having a complex network of gates, throwing in a bunch of random values into those gates, called the deep neural network, and then training it to try to come out with a good outcome, and having up what's called an error function that says, well, you're this wrong here, and you can go back and correct it by getting that feedback, kind of this what's called back propagation. So you take the error, look at it, and say, gee, if we adjusted the values of these weights, we can get a better value. And it works really well on what are called continuous functions, not really big breaks. And when you do that, you're often coming out with a system that's optimal, although sometimes the network will settle into things that are suboptimal depending on your random values. So you're never really guaranteed to get the optimal answer, and you can't actually explain what those weights really are doing. You can kind of say, well, they're taking data representation in one space and you're transforming them all into another weird space, and that space makes it easier to draw a line between the trues and the false. But it is basically it's a random process, and because it's a random process, even though there's learning, there's lots more risks to that, and there's actually no guarantees that you're going to reach optimal solutions.
Got it.
Is that a good summary?
Yeah. Would you say it's more probabilistic as opposed to deterministic?
Yes. Absolutely. That's
So-
statistically generated or probabilistic. The only thing you're going to generate is not an absolute, this is the right answer. It's a probability. I have a 99.9% probability based on my prior training that this is the right answer.
Right. And it's we're going to get into in a little bit the ethics of all that, because I think it's one of the major questions is that when the computer sees it as a game, it doesn't understand the ramifications. And to me, I'm really also glad you brought up that stuff, the theory of mind, because like I said, I'm not a computer person, but one thing I did put a lot of study into, it was the kind of like philosophy of thinking of the various militaries throughout the Cold War. And like we mentioned Reagan, but I think actually that's a great way to talk about it. Reagan basically fundamentally changed the theory of mind of the Cold War, because we had gotten it sort of seemed like most international leaders had learned what the computer had learned, that a thermonuclear war was pointless, and so we shouldn't, like, we need to have our weapons, because if we don't have our weapons, it won't be pointless. But as long as we have our weapons, like, it can be a deterrent to each other. But of course, the problem with that is that it assumes that everyone, as you talked about, that everyone is being a rational actor, that everyone's properly sharing that theory of mind. And I'm trying here to apply what I know to the theories you're talking about. But so it sounds like what Reagan introduced was the irrational actor, because there's actually a lot of documents that we've now gotten out of the Soviets from this point. They were all terrified because they thought they've very much had this kind of thinking of like, no one's going to ever try to have a nuclear war now, but they thought Reagan wanted to win, and it could have just changed the whole game from their perspective.
Right. I would argue that what Reagan did was he introduced a new type of play to the game. So we talked about a prisoner's dilemma, where you have two people that might betray or not betray each other, is the standard prisoner's dilemma. And there's rules that you can follow in an iterated prisoner's dilemma. So you do the prisoner's dilemma over and over, and you see whether or not you're going to betray a bunch, or whether or not you're going to stay strong, or whether you're going to both betray. And there's different rules that you can use for that. Right. And so you could have the person who always stays strong. Well, they'll always lose to a person that always betrays. But then there'll be like rules where you stay strong once, and if the other person betrays, you match them. You tit for tat, right? And so Reagan introduced a totally different paradigm of how how he was going to play the game, right? Tit for tat as a strategy is a huge improvement over always stay strong. And it's also a huge improvement over always betray if you have a whole lot of people playing with each other and each taking, like, you play 3 or 4 rounds with each person. These different kinds of strategies, he basically introduced a whole new strategy for the Cold War, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of I want to escalate things, which nobody wanted to escalate. Right. And he decided on an escalation strategy that was just different. And you're right that trying to model Reagan's theory of mind, trying to figure out what his strategy was just wildly different from everything that happened in the Cold War prior to that point. Right.
Wasn't there also kind of another dimension to the like game, so to speak, of sort of the economic dimension of not escalating in order to theoretically win an actual nuclear war, but escalating to basically force escalation on the other side in order to basically burn through resources and thus win economically, essentially?
That's the in retrospect view of, like, Reagan pushed their economy until it collapsed.
But that's not like the actual motivation.
Well, it's hard to anticipate. It's hard to say that was his actual plan because we had tried that, right? Mm-hmm. The space race was exactly the same.
Right.
We spent 4% of our GDP on a moon launch, which is outrageous, right? That's a humongous amount to pour into a pure science project. And then we did a similar thing again, another generation later for Star Wars, which didn't yield any fruit, right? We don't have interceptors.
Yeah, there is no.
Like we've never built them, and so how did he? He could say we tried the same thing. Let's try it again, and it happened to work, but. It's difficult to say that it's a just so story, right? It's a perfect explanation that makes everything work out, but it's hard to tell that it would have worked in advance, and it's hard to tell that it was even a sensible plan.
The question you asked is basically probably like the biggest question that like historians of the Cold War in the 80s have, with like a whole bunch of people who are writing books saying, all the books that say like Reagan won the war definitely have that idea that he this was his plan. A lot of the others are like, no, he was a brinksmanship person who got kind of lucky, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But
the thing is, like, we have a sample size of 1, right? It's like it's really hard to draw conclusions from a sample size of 1. You don't get to like, oh, let's run that simulation again. Oops, blow up the planet. Like.
And like, as much as I will happily dunk on Reagan until the cows come home, but like, it wasn't like it was 40 years of perfect game theory until then. Like, I think you would also say like both Khrushchev and Kennedy is basically just like raise back. Like you can look at the Cuban Missile Crisis as basically just brinksmanship of who's going to quit first.
Right.
And who's going to blink?
Who's going to blink? And it turns out it was Gorbachev. And like, I mean, I assume there's a lot of complicated stuff because, like, I don't think that Reagan's strategy could have worked if, for instance, they didn't have to spend an unbelievably huge amount of money dealing with Chernobyl, right?
And Afghanistan.
And Afghanistan, yeah, for sure, absolutely.
And to me, that kind of shows how much any kind of model, like the challenges of like a general AI or something that can actually understand everything that's going on in the world. It's like you can model one situation, but then that situation always is going to interact with some other situation that, like, are you modeling these independently, or is there some way to actually have them interact with each other? And that's why I personally imagine like it might take a while longer than people seem to be concerned about in terms of like really coming up with effective models of like the world at like in its entirety.
Right.
I don't know.
Well, especially
is that fair? Okay. that was to the.
There's a question for Dan, I think.
I just play with games all day. Like I play with AIs of the more specific, right? Like,
and they're getting better every year, aren't they?
Amazingly rapidly getting better. I just want to mention a couple chess engines, just in reference to what Dan was saying, where there's like an engine Stockfish, the original Stockfish, that like basically. My understanding is that they basically said, okay, this is what the pieces are worth. Here's the goal of the game. Okay, now go brute force, your way through the game to figure out what move to make in any given position, right? And it would just go off and calculate 32 moves deep, and it's like, okay, this is what we want to play. And then eventually something called Alpha Zero came out from DeepMind, which learned, I think it learned chess, Go, and shogi, and like was just crush it. It destroyed Stockfish, but what it did was it was like self-learning, right? It actually, they just told it the rules of the game and then just ran it for like I think it was like a day or something. They let it learn. Like it's like a 1 day old or something. I might have that wrong, but like not a long time. They haven't put it back online because it took a ton of resources, right? And it just instantly was the best player in the world. And the interesting thing about Alpha Zero, and later they made another one called Leela Chess Zero, which is like Alpha Zero, but it's run on like everyone's computers. Like you can donate your computing power to let Leela play more games and then improve. The interesting thing is when you looked at their moves, they like have these kind of more human ideas. These like ideas where a human can look at it and kind of intuit, oh, I see the idea behind that. I see what you're doing there. Whereas with Stockfish, it's like there's things people refer to as like computer moves that it's like, I mean, if you see 32 moves into the future, this move makes sense. But there's no like really kind of intuitive way of conceptualizing, you're making, you're locking the queen in the corner. So basically that piece is losing value or, this and that. And there's actually some
micro strategies rather than a holistic look at it all, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And like Leela then eventually plateaued, even though, she kept like running on everybody's computers. And then they took Stockfish and they added an NNUE, and like now it's destroying everybody, and it gains like 50 rating points every like few months or something insane. It's just like, I mean, it's going from where a human couldn't beat any computer to now a human, not any computer, but the best computer, like, and now no human can beat the computer like given 2 pawns, and it's like it just keeps the rate of learning is really spectacular.
And you think of chess as being like, I want to wrap this up soon and move the ethics, but just one last thing about this, and Paul, tell me if I'm wrong here, but you think of chess as kind of one of the easier games for a computer to model because the number of variables is very limited. It's like there are 8 pieces and 16 pieces on each side. That's never going to change. It's all, the rules are always going to be the same. Something like poker, obviously, is a lot more variables, bet size, but also just different player types and the like. My understanding, though, is that like for a while, weren't there like people were creating bots that could play online poker and win pretty reliably?
Oh, I mean, that's still a thing, and that's a real threat to poker, like in the future, right? Is real-time assistance, is people either using charts that are pre-generated by, poker solvers, or eventually having real-time solvers. I mean, if I want to run a complicated hand, it's going to take half an hour or an hour. If I want to run some pre-flop simulation, you could run it for a month on a server. You can rent, people rent servers and then run these sims for a month, and it's like, all right, here's your entire pre-flop strategy. But I mean, chess, though, like there's more possible positions, I think, than atoms in the universe or something like that.
Yeah,
it's like
absolutely.
10 to the 120th or something, massive. So I think it's a deceptively complex game. It looks simple, but like, but then you think about that and you're like, okay, but let's compare that to the whole world. And it's like, that's a tough problem.
Well, so this is a good way for me to transition into the ethics side of it, but I'm really glad we did that because I think you have to really understand all these issues to talk about this. We're talking about how good these computers are. So does the central idea of just handing over control to the computers make sense? Like what's your thought when you watch this idea of someone saying human error can cause problems in the military? Let's let the computer decide.
So I'll just jump in here because this is such a hot topic for me in my job every day. Before we started to release these machine learning models, people really didn't have a clear idea of the negative harm that they could do to small subsets of the population, right? That we applied them in general. We said on average, they're going to, make better recommendations in clinical settings and things. But then what we started to see is that there was these edge cases, these unusual combinations where the recommendations weren't very good. And in fact, sometimes they were doing harm.
And just to be clear, what you're talking about, for those who haven't heard you talk before, is you're designing the computer models that, like, when an insurance company looks at everything and says, okay, well, this we can cover and that we can cover, that's the kind of decision making you're talking about.
Not quite. Those are called adjudication engines, which they say you will process the claim, it passes all the rules, or it doesn't process. Very, very deterministic. If this, else then. I'm really talking about where we take a lot of information from the patient's chart and do diagnosis and then make clinical care paths. You should take this drug and this sequence with these things and look for these side effects and things like that. And those are called clinical decision support systems. And to be honest, we don't have any clinical decisions today that use AI. And the reason is that we can't trust them. Right. We simply can't get them to explain why they would make certain decisions. They are good at human in the loop. Hey, have you thought about this? But we don't actually take the humans out of the loop when lives are at stake, to be blunt.
Yeah.
We do that if you have diabetes and you have a blood glucose pump and you're monitoring the blood glucose levels, and we're going to put a little bit of insulin into your blood. But those aren't really deep learning neural networks. They're deterministic rules, and they've been tested over so many different types of patients and conditions and errors and stuff like that. So we are at the verge today of really starting to understand the whole possibilities of data, putting them through these black boxes, which you can't explain what they're doing. And we're starting to get the sense that we have a much better chance of making good recommendations without bias, without putting minorities and women at risk because we didn't test them and they weren't in our data set. We're getting to the stage where we can start to make good recommendations, and our physicians, I think in 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we'll start to trust them. But right now, it's very, very advisory. So the bottom line is, in the real world, humans are almost always in the loop for a machine learning based systems, right, unless it's very, very precisely tested in things where software is a device, right? Software as a device is a term that the FDA uses, saying this is a very, very well tested on all possible parameters and errors, and it still is not going to kill your patient, right? That's the key thing, or do harm. So I think the key though is everybody has this fear, right? There are over 50 bills in the United States pending right now that are putting legislation in place to make sure that when companies put together AI, that they actually test them adequately, right? So they're not trusting anybody. Right. There's obviously a lot of liability to this, but there's a lot of fear, right? And we saw this with a lot of negatives on face recognition, right? Where law enforcement was putting face recognition in, and it did really well on white males, right? Because that's what they tested it on. But when you had people with dark skin, it didn't pick up the right contrast. It made lots of misidentifications, and it caused people harm.
Yeah, right? And at least 2 of the cases of shooting of unarmed people, it started because of a false identification based on that software.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's not just one piece of software, but many companies were doing this. And why? Because it's so lucrative, right? If you're running a security for large buildings, you want to be able to have cameras, you want to have them identify people, and you want to be able to identify when there are people that you don't know in the building. All those things people pay good money for because security guards are expensive. So there was a ton of money going into this, and then we started to see a good technology get misused by a small percentage of the population, but then it started to become a very strong negative, and then companies just decided we do not want our brand associated with that. Amazon got out very early. A lot of other companies just said, no, we're not going to be in that business.
Right.
And so as a result, because of lack of testing, because of lack of quality, a technology which could be useful for some use cases was used inappropriately, and that's one of the fears that a lot of people have too.
Well, I think it's right. I think that's what the whole movie is about. Because, yeah, I get why there's some like. I think the person who refuses to turn the key is a hero, not a problem at the start of the movie. But I do get the idea of like there are situations where people have to make hard decisions, and if they don't, you understand why it's difficult for them to do the thing they have to do, but if they don't do the thing, there could be massive problems. And so the idea of removing the human from that decision, I get why it is so tempting. And like, you know, a lot of science fiction, especially in the 60s and 70s, in 50s, like the one that most comes to mind for me is the moon is a harsh mistress. But it's one of the whole concepts of it is that so much of the problem with politics and economics is that humans cannot take their own biases out of decision making. So we'll just have a computer make all the decisions. And I think one of the reasons why I love this movie so much is it's a very understandable philosophy, but this movie is really showing what the danger of that is. And as I said, it's because you take a human out of the way. Now you have to completely trust the computer. And if the computer makes a mistake, which often is because you made a mistake in designing the computer.
Yep.
There's
garbage in, garbage out, as they say. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would actually, like from that perspective in WarGames, my favorite character rewatching it, because I haven't watched it in a long time, and I always thought that the general is kind of he's coded as the bad guy, right?
Yeah.
He's blustery. He's a jerk to everybody. He like directly insults the programmers repeatedly, but he's right. Like like every decision that he makes is perfectly sensible over the course of the whole movie, and he's a jerk because he's allowed to be, because he's a general, right? And so he can tell people when they're being idiots, and he's used to being able to tell his tech people, look, I know you're smart, but I've got other considerations besides a new toy, right? And so I was like, I like him.
Yeah, I definitely
liked
had
it when
that.
I was younger.
I felt like he had a bit more of kind of like a redemption arc where, not that he was really wrong in the beginning, but like he also wasn't really right, you know?
Yeah.
I mean,
he didn't have enough information.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And so instead of like seeking more information, which would be the rational thing to do, he just like took his stance and then dug in. But I thought he was willing to pivot when it became abundantly clear that was the thing to do. So
yeah, like in some ways, I think the most important moral decision of the movie is where he basically says, like, the computers are telling us we're about to be attacked.
Yep.
All logic says we should fire our missiles now before we get hit. But I'm gonna, and there's a very weird scene where he's like, "Hey guys, I'm possibly gonna listen to you all get killed. Just let's keep an open phone line. Don't run to the shelters that you should be running to. You know?
Just tell us if you die."
Yeah, right.
No. We'll hear if you die. Don't worry.
Just give us a call back if you get blown up. If not, we'll just assume you're fine. Wait, no, that's not how that works. That's my mom and I used to make that joke all the time. I'll call you if I get blown up. You know, back when we lived in New York, shortly after things were getting blown up. But
dark humor was a big part of New York City in early 2000s.
Always, I'm
after 9/11.
Yeah.
I would push back on just the statement, all logic was saying that they were attacking. Like, I think it was a logical decision that led him to, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't think that was an illogical, human intuition, kind of decision. I feel like that was actually the logic, and that the almost the more human thing is to not listen to all the facts when there's really loud indications in your face of one thing, but then under the surface it's like, wait, but this is actually more important, even if it's not in my face. I thought that was actually a very rational decision that was hard to come to,
Yeah, that's maybe a better way.
I do think it was the most heroic act in the movie in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
For sure.
Definitely. Well, and so I think a big part of what the movie's also about is, because I think the thing that as I understand it, the thing that the computer gets wrong, and it's only because the computer's doing what it's been told to, is that it is treating thermonuclear war as a game. And like,
Yes.
When as I've been learning poker, primarily through Paul, but also, other books and studying and the like, one thing that's drilled in is like, you want to play in a way that if you face the same situation again and again and again, you're going to win enough times and win enough money that you're going to overall over 1,000 times come out ahead. And that's a lot of the game theory is, assuming you can, that because a larger game of poker is more than just the one hand. And Paul's making faces and probably getting a lot of this wrong, but that's a basic idea. And my understanding is that like a big part of what the movie is about is that because of that, Joshua doesn't understand that losing a single game of global thermonuclear war is much more disastrous. And also that like it, not even losing, but just that everyone's going to lose it. It doesn't understand the consequences that this is much more than a game. And is that correct? That like kind of that, because to me, the way it would seem to me is that that's the primary flaw in how Whopper is designed, is it's designed to think of this as a game, so it does not take into account the consequences of its actions.
Well, I would also argue that Falcon makes the case that they trained Whopper to win.
Right.
They didn't train Whopper to not lose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the key. Because there's no winning that's not losing, really. But
Right.
humans can think there is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so the data set they sent it through and the simulations they sent it through, they said, we want you to win. They defined the parameters of what winning was, and they didn't, but they had it play against other opponents, right? And the question I question when they say early on, all it does is think about how to win a thermonuclear war all day, every day. I'm like, so you're building a humongous training set right now? I don't like, yeah.
I will say one thing that was confusing to me was like, if it's learning this fast at the end, what's it been doing for the last decade?
Yeah, I think it's right. What Rob is asking is, if it's been training,
right.
How has it ever won the game in the past?
Right. And I think the thing that like they failed to teach it that the preferred outcome should be a draw. Like, and not just like a draw because everyone's annihilated, like a draw that nobody plays. Like, like they gave it the conditions of like winning is having more casualties there, but not so many here. And it's like, that's that's an intractable problem, right? Like there's no like actually fighting a thermonuclear war and winning. That's not a thing. It's always a loss, right? Like once it happens. And so it happening is a loss. And then really like it should be studying diplomacy or something.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think two of the most, you both have said much more succinctly what I was trying to ask in that question of like the problem of teaching it that this is a game where winning, because to me, two of the most effective lines in the whole movie, the computer has this like, it doesn't, I don't think any accurate toward an actual computer voice. I mean, I guess a computer voice is whatever you program it to be to a speaker, but it's, Matthew Broderick's character, David asks, what is the primary goal of the whole system?
Right.
And it just says to win the game.
Yeah.
And then later he asks, is this a game or is it real? And the computer answers, what's the difference?
Right.
And to me, those are both chilling. And like, that's the heart of the movie right there.
Yeah.
That it doesn't understand that.
Yeah. And to me, I just want to say like, that's human error. That's
exactly.
The way they designed it, what they told it, the goals to be. Like that's humans did that, right? And so it's like it's not the machine's fault. It's like if you program a self-driving car, which like personally in this instance, like I think we should just have self-driving cars now. Like they're better than humans. Humans are terrible at driving. Maybe it's close. I think terrible drivers should have self-driving cars, and driving tests should be super hard. And if you can demonstrate you drive better than a self-driving car, you get to drive. But if you drive like most terrible drivers, you don't get to drive. That's what I think.
And I think the self-driving car is the perfect example of what we're talking about of making the hard decision. Because, and I don't know the current state of this, but I know one of the questions that was coming up a lot with self-driving car is, you're in a situation where you got 4 people right in front of you. You're either going to hit them and probably kill them, but the only way to avoid that is to make a very sharp left turn or a right turn. Now you're going to slam into a wall or whatever. And so basically you have the proper choice is to risk your own life to protect the lives of these other people.
I mean,
Mhm.
is
And-
it? But you know,
Well, that's the
the
whole point.
question.
Is that
yeah.
Yeah.
my understanding was that some of the models that were being used to train some self-driving cars, the car would automatically crash your car to avoid hitting those other people, and like. So, to me, so that and like maybe that is the right thing we want cars to do,
No.
but that's when that's the whole point. Like,
No, but the thing is, okay, so I'm just going to object to that whole premise, which I've heard like a bunch of times, right? It's the trolley problem, but you're on the other track, right? The other track is a cliff instead of one person, right? There's 5 people on one side of the track, and there's a cliff on the other side, and it's a trolley, right? Like the correct answer is you build a car that can see people far enough ahead that this is not a thing, right? Then that's the car that you put out there.
but people are dumb and drunk and fall in front of the car at the last moment.
No, but but you slow down when there's somebody within a distance that's a concern.
That works in a lot of situations. My problem with a lot of self-driving car situations is, like we've been saying, the world is big and messy and complicated. Right? We can simplify it way down, but people, people are clueless enough that they step out in front of trains.
Sure.
Right. People come around building corners too fast. You have bicyclists that come out in front of your car, and you have a very short amount of time to react. And sometimes you have to make two bad decisions, right? You have a bicyclist that darted out, and you have 2 people on the sidewalk. You hit the bicyclist, you hit the 2 people. Sometimes you have that choice, right? It's just going to come up eventually that you have to make a judgment call about these 2 bad decisions.
So,
and what do you do with it, right?
I think you lower the speed limit.
I mean, strategically agreed.
And people
our
don't want
roads
to do
are
that.
terrible.
But like there's like a game theoretically optimal speed for cars to go, basically, based on the possibilities.
Yeah, like redesigning our cities, making lower speed limits, and if we had self-driving cars that actually communicated with each other,
right? Yeah, exactly.
Everybody could make this congestion solution problem happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you have perfect modeling of all the traffic and everything, but you're not going to have that because you have companies that are going to fight, right? You have Tesla self-driving cars versus Ford self-driving cars. What's going to happen?
But you don't have to, right? I mean, that's like a legislative issue at the end of it, in terms of in our world, you could set that up. But if you're not doing that because companies have too much power, again, I'd say that's a human problem.
But that's not even companies having too much power. I actually want Tesla and Ford to have different self-driving car models and different AIs behind them.
Okay. Yeah.
Because if you do that, then you have competition that drives your AIs to be better and be different.
But can they still talk to each other? Can there still be some requisite?
They could. They could. Yeah.
I think the factor that's getting missed here is not even that the companies wouldn't want to do that, but in a world where a third of our country won't take a vaccine that is clearly purely the best for you, people are not going to be comfortable driving cars where they think all the cars are talking to each other, because that means that they're all plotting and the liberals can figure whatever the heck conspiracy theory it's going to be.
Yeah, well, but that doesn't make it not the best solution. That makes it a solution we can't enact, like all the other solutions that would be good solutions that we can't enact because people are horrible. And
game theory gets to socialism every single time. There's no
well, it's something that I also mention here is a snarky the Copenhagen interpretation of ethics. Mm-hmm. If you touch a problem, you're now responsible for it.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So if we avoid that a bit in the roadways, it's kind of weird that we actually will legislate incremental improvements. It's one of the places where we definitely seatbelts don't save every life, right? They can't save every life, but they're way better than not having them. But with self-driving cars, people think that they have to solve every potential problem, right?
Yeah.
And with AI, they think, well, it has to solve every problem, or we shouldn't let it out. It shouldn't be 10% better. It should be 100% better.
Right. And it might be 90% better, and they'd still be like, oh, it's causing 10% of, it's
exactly.
Eliminate.
Yeah, because there are some small number of people, and I think we're getting this better and better, but seatbelts can be more dangerous for some people, people who have like chest, like it's pretty rare and it's getting much rarer, but like certainly like they figured out that like seatbelts were very dangerous for young kids in some situations.
Right.
And like
So
same with airbags and things like that. So it's getting better, but yeah, none of these things are 100%.
Yep.
We don't have too much more time, so I want to shift to another kind of it's a computer thing, but it's also the ethical thing, which is let's talk about hacking. Because you all talked about how that what he does in this is actually sort of fairly realistic. And it's interesting to me that you were saying that, because one of the things I noticed in the movie is he never types a line of code at all. Like he figures out a password mostly through kind of human engineering, and then like he knows how to use the modem and stuff like that. But at least what we see on screen is not what I think of as hacking. And I think that's because the media has given me a bad understanding of what hacking is. But
I think he writes a script. I think he writes one script to war dial. The whole phrase war dialing comes from this movie. He writes the war dialing script and he uses it to check every phone to see whether or not it has a modem at the other end.
Yeah.
Right.
But
you
otherwise, see him writing the script, right? Because
it's true. It's true. He could have gotten it from his two geeky friends, right?
Yeah.
Could be. Yep. Downloaded it off the old Bell Labs UUCP Unix to Unix copy networks at the time, all dial-up modems.
Correct me if I'm wrong, if maybe the two of you know this more, but like actual hacking, my understanding from people who I've talked to about it is that it's less about writing code yourself necessarily, and often there will be programs that you acquire that you run, and maybe you make modifications or something. But
yeah, there's
absolutely
agreed. There's basically like making your own exploits, which is like deep magic nowadays. Like building your own 0-day is very difficult and very expensive in a lot of cases.
Okay.
But like taking and repurposing existing tools,
right?
I would bet that the single most sophisticated piece of software ever released for hacking was probably Stuxnet. Would you agree, Dan?
Yeah, it's right up there. I know that there are literally hundreds of quote software packages for doing ransomware.
Yeah,
and anybody can, you just have to set up the servers and do things to protect your privacy, and you can launch ransomware bots, right? So they are very low tech, right? They are simply doing social engineering. Please click this thing and download this thing. But you're right. There are other things that are usually so complicated. They're designed by hundreds of engineers in large government agencies, and they get leaked out.
Right.
Yeah.
Israel has done very, very complicated things to put eavesdropping things on cell phones.
Yep.
But tens of millions of dollars went into those tools.
Right. And my example of Stuxnet was the U.S. government.
Yes.
And so like the U.S. government made Stuxnet. There was what was the name of the one that made Merck go down for like a month? That was the Russian government that was orchestrated against Ukraine, and then just happened to jump over to Merck systems. Israel's done a bunch. China had that incredible exploit where you could run an entire where they proved that PDFs were Turing complete, and like they did some absolutely incredible airdrop is the name of it. And
I have to say you're ruining a lot of my dreams, because the movies of the 80s and 90s taught me that hackers were high school kids with piercings and tattoos or bad haircuts who knew how to talk to a computer more than they knew how to talk to a girl. And you're basically telling me that all the best hacking software has been written by governments.
I mean, that's true in the last 20 years.
I'm horrified, but I'm not surprised.
But you can still get high school kids download a ransomware package and set up a ransomware thing on a couple servers, right?
Yeah.
You do not have to have a degree in computer science to do bad things and malicious things.
Right.
There's no question about it.
And so that's a good question to ask, though, because I think I was talking to a friend of mine about like, has this movie aged well? And this is a person who does like quality assurance and stuff like that. And her point was, it seems impossible to believe that computer security could have been that bad.
It was though. The big example. So Sneakers does this, which is another incredibly good movie. If you have not watched Sneakers, it's 100 times better than this at hacking. Actually,
good.
They've got a deaf guy, Whistler, and he's referenced on an actual
Blind
person.
guy, right? Blind
Guy, not deaf, blind guy named Whistler, and he's referenced on an actual person who literally hacked the phone network because what they did is they sent tones over the phone to determine whether or not something was long distance or whatever. You had they had both the audio channel that you spoke on and the data channel that was like sending who you're calling on the same audio line. And so he could whistle because he had perfect pitch and he was blind.
Yeah.
He could whistle the tones to like make long distance calls for free. It wasn't that complicated.
No,
at the time.
I mean, there's a version of that.
There's a Steve Jobs Wozniak episode where they had a guy named Captain Crunch, and he got special whistles in the Captain Crunch things and could hack into the phone systems, and that's how they made some of their early adventures into that stuff. Yeah, the key thing about this is we're all made the assumption that nobody's actually going to read the manuals of how these things work. It's all security by obscurity.
Exactly.
And now we know that with open source and all these systems, you can't do that. So you do have to secure things with two-factor authentication and those things. So we have progressed quite a bit, but it is very uneven. Right. And there are many companies that are set up by non-security professionals that leave gaping holes, that don't use two-factor. There are companies that sell security cameras in your home, and they put in a default password. And within 20 minutes of these security cameras going online, there are Russian and Chinese hackers that are watching everything in your house. Right. So people are very sloppy. And then they learn the hard way that you have to put into good security protocols.
Well, Dan, I will have you know that you trained your daughters well, because when we first moved into this house, I like the idea that everything is on the computers and I can say, hey, G word, turn on the lights or whatever it is, and that thing. And one of the things that I thought was awesome was, let's do that with our front door, so that like when someone knocks and we're on the living room, I can look at my computer, look at my phone, and just be like, "Oh, okay, that's what I recognize." Press
what could possibly go wrong? Yeah.
Well, and the point is, Mary, my spouse, Dan's daughter, gave the exact look of horror that Rob was giving a moment ago, and was like, "Absolutely not." So that is a lesson that you passed down well.
I would also contend that some people never learn. So when you're Stuxnet, I'm going to go back to as an example. Most of Stuxnet's technology was in the deployment. It was trying to get the package to the hardware. What its goal was to break industrial centrifuges that were used for separating out uranium, and the actual centrifuges had almost no security. Once you got to them, whatever. Industrial control machines are terrible for this. I work in industry, and if you actually get past the gatekeeper computer, you can do whatever, right?
Well, and that's one of the things I like most about the movie is that even Dr. Falcon, who is the computer expert, yes, he creates this backdoor password, but he makes the password the name of his son.
Yes, exactly.
If I'm going to social hack someone to figure out what kind of password they use, that's a pretty obvious one.
Yes.
And same like the schools, all their words were like pencil or class or, again, things that.
At least make it an anagram, right? I mean, too many secrets.
Right.
Come on.
I do love the idea of a kid intentionally being sent to detention every now and then so that he can get access to just pulling out the thing.
Right.
So let me ask you the kind of one or two last questions as we start to wrap up, or at least one, maybe I won't get to the last one, but Rob, you mentioned at the beginning kind of that like our protagonist character, one of the two protagonists, David, is really the protagonist, is amoral in a way that like where Jennifer, the kind of the love interest, but I think a fairly well developed one for the early 80s, which the bar is very low.
Bar's
for
low.
That.
But it cleared
and
that
also
bar.
5-year-old me just thought she was wonderful, but that like she's the one who has a problem with doing it. What do you kind of think of the morality of the talk about what you meant about him being amoral and kind of the morality of hacking? I'm fairly certain what Paul's response is going to be, though I might be wrong there.
I was already queuing it up in my mind.
When we talk about high school as imprisonment, but Rob, you start. Like, what's kind of your take on David's character?
So his character is he does not care if what he does hurts other people. And the entire first chunk of his story is he shows up late to class, it doesn't bother with learning any of the material, and like the teacher is coded as a jerk and bad at teaching, but that fundamentally doesn't matter to whether or not you are like the teacher can be super good and you can be disruptive, and he be disruptive in the same kinds of situations, I'm pretty sure. So he doesn't care whether or not he hurts other people. He cares about eventually making his grade work, but he isn't concerned whether or not breaking into the system like does any harm to anybody. He doesn't believe in getting the grade that he earned, which agreed, school's crap. But he isn't willing to even contemplate the universe where showing up and being a jerk to everybody else is wrong. Right? And he kind of draws in as a model of like, hey, I'm so smart and I can get a benefit from being narcissistic here, right? He draws in Ali Sheedy's character very heavily on that. And then he doesn't let her consent to his breaking rules for her, right? He breaks rules, shows her the result. She says, don't do that. Then he says, okay, unbreaks the rule, and then breaks the rule again as soon as she turns around, because her decisions don't matter to him, right?
It's interesting because as you describe it, like I want to push back a little bit on the morality, because I think there's a problem with him, but it comes from a different direction. But the first thing I hear is basically what this is telling me is that in this movie, in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, he's fundamentally playing the same character.
Yeah, he is.
And
you could view them as a sequel. Like, it's not any different, right?
I think he actually doesn't. I think in Ferris Bueller, he also hacks into a computer system to change a grade. So yeah, it might be more online than I thought. But also, it feels like, to me, what I see is not necessarily like a moral choice as much as it is, this is a spoiled white kid from the suburbs. Like, to me, one of those telling lines of his, of what he says is when she's like, "We could go to jail," and he responds, "We're under 18." You know, he just
not if you're under 18. Yeah,
he's living in that there are no consequences for my act. Like, I don't think he doesn't care about the consequences. Well, I guess there's another way of saying it. I think he just doesn't believe there will be, because
he's unaware of the consequences and doesn't believe they exist.
Right. Yeah.
Because everything in his life has taught him that there aren't substantial consequences to most of his actions.
Yeah.
Right.
And his apology is going to be, "I'm sorry I got caught." Right?
Yeah.
Right? Yep. I mean, you could see him just saying, "Sorry that I got caught here," right?
Yeah.
So I'll say that I only have a problem with one thing he did in the entire movie, and that was change her grade after she asked him not to.
Yeah, that felt really...
Yeah, she was like, "No, change it back." He changed it back, and then he changed it again and made it an A, which is so dumb. Like, if you're gonna cheat and change your grades, don't make it something so obvious.
But here's the deal. He did for himself. He changed his grade to a C.
I know.
Right?
I know.
But then he changed... He didn't care whether or not she got caught.
Right, exactly. And my wife was like, "Is he trying to get her caught?"
Yeah.
like seriously, like thinking maybe that was a possibility, and maybe it was, but I don't think it was. But yeah, that was the only thing that like I was like, that doesn't feel good. Like, no, don't do that. Like, but like changing like summer school, I think is immoral. I don't really believe in morality, but like I think learning's the most important thing basically a person could do, aside from like, you know, not killing each other and stuff like that. But like, just the school system, like they're basically forced to be in a place and treated poorly, and like I don't think it's good. And so like, if you want to do whatever you want to do to not be there, like I'm fine with that. And like, if you want to break into some company's thing, you know, fine, whatever, I don't really care. Like, he almost caused a nuclear war because I think he's like kind of like more of a dumbass, but like really this was a fairly improbable scenario. I think it's fair to not assume that like
the game you're playing is going to...
No, he was warned. His two tech friends, when he went to them, said he showed this to them, and they said, "This is not the game company. This is a federal system, right?
Right.
This is a government system. This is beyond top secret.
That's true.
Do not
but to me, here I'm going to defend him some more because I'm more on the he's a dumbass thing, in part because I think his arc in the movie is that the minute he recognizes real consequences to his actions, he's now running all over the country, or at least in the Northwest, to try and fix those things. And what I saw happen when he talks to his two friends is they're not saying, watch out, you could hack into the system and do damage.
Right.
They're saying, watch out, you could get caught.
Right. And he doesn't.
And that's where his teenage boy, I'm invincible, I'm a teenage male in America, but also a white suburban kid, but also I'm under 18, I'll be fine. So like, I think it's not that he believes there will be consequences and dismisses them. It's that I think he thinks these two adults who are telling him there were consequences are wrong.
Right. Yeah, I think that's fair. I do think once he is warned that it's probably some government thing, like there should maybe be a thought that not that like it's not a game, but it's like maybe something will go wrong and that might cause some harm, but he's basically looking at Zork, right? I mean, it's just like a text screen that's just like,
Yeah, like I think it's a fair assumption to think the government isn't dumb enough to let me launch missiles.
I don't know what the government's ever done that makes you think that's a fair assumption.
His assumption that this is kind of a game, right?
Yeah.
That he gets into the system and he thinks it's like a strategic modeling system.
Right.
Yeah. And sure, that makes sense that he'll get into the strategic modeling system. He knows as soon as he figures out that things are bad, that he could get in trouble, and that they're going to do a trace on him and they're going to find him. Right. And he knows that they're going to show up at his exact house, and he's like, maybe they didn't get a trace. He's aware of all of the technical components that are sitting out in front of him, and he just doesn't think through any of his actions because he doesn't think like you're saying, consequences don't matter to him. Right.
To me, my favorite example of that is I threw out the number. They find it in the trash. Like, it doesn't occur to him that the FBI agent would look at his trash can.
Actually, that
helped him.
Yes, that helps him. They go, yes, we agree. He also makes it clear that he's probably stealing long distance from the phone company, right? Which, like, moral or not, like stealing from Ma Bell isn't necessarily wrong they're a rent-seeking giant business sense, but at the same time, it shows that he just doesn't care whether or not he's stealing, right?
Yeah. So, quick check-in question. We're getting towards the close time. Paul, do I have time to ask one more big question that might go a few more minutes extra? Or do we?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So take back. So the last ethical question I want to raise, and this is less about the computers, but it is about kind of the way the computer genius thinks. What do you think of Falcon? Like, because when we get introduced to him, they explain to him, at first he's just like, he wants to be a hermit, he wants to be left alone. And then they explain to him what's going to happen. And he's basically like, okay. And he kind of talks about how extinction is a natural part of life and that don't worry, the bees will take over and they'll do something. And when they push him a little more, it's why he's basically okay with the erasure of humanity. And he acknowledges there'll be horrible suffering for the people who survive. And he says kind of like, because it's all futile. He has become convinced that humanity will never learn. That like, because as he explains it, he always wanted Joshua to teach everyone else that nuclear war is impossible, and that as he understands it, it didn't happen. And so I'm curious, I think obviously allowing nuclear war to obliterate the planet is morally wrong. I think we can kind of agree in that kind of a general sense, but like, I'm curious what you think of, given what he's been through, his position.
I have a succinct reply, which is basically that he seems to think everything is futile, and they change his mind by getting him to think everything's not futile. And then they teach the computer that tic-tac-toe is futile, and thus they win by teaching the computer the meaning of futility.
That's an interesting insight. I like that. That.
Well, and that's what he says. He literally says, I couldn't teach Joshua futility.
Right. Yeah.
Which, why it never occurred to him to have it play tic-tac-toe against itself, I don't quite understand.
When you put that in as a game, and yeah, exactly.
And he said it, and he had 0 players programmed in. I actually think that him in a nutshell is when they're sitting, when Matthew Broderick's character is sitting there trying to figure it out, and they're all trying to figure out how to they like play 3 rounds of tic-tac-toe, and then Falcon knows the system better than anybody.
Yeah.
He knows, and he could have said up front, you can set it to 0 players to have it play itself.
Right.
But he never volunteers anything.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Like ever. He doesn't feel that I assume that he's burnt out. He's tried volunteering information, and he's come to the conclusion that that volunteering information, that telling people up front, doesn't work. That people have to figure things out for themselves. And he'll answer questions, but he'll never tell people in advance that something's.
He wants them to learn.
Right. And so they have to turn and ask him, is there a way to make it play itself? And then he gives the very simple, well, you just enter 0 players answer. Right.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because one thing I always noticed, and I've never quite connected it though, is that he has this very kind of like the happy teacher as the student figures something out smile.
Yeah.
As Matthew Broderick's going through all that. Like
you asked. Good.
Yeah.
I've been waiting.
Learning is very important. It's critical. It shouldn't happen in school. It should happen in underground nuclear bunkers.
Right.
Where you have 3 minutes.
Where you have 3 minutes until the extinction of humankind. That's where the best learning takes place.
Yeah. I think it's very important that you learn to ask experts questions.
Yes.
Yes. There's a big movement in schools right now to try to get away from like tests and like the whole exam culture. And one of the key ideas is that it's very hard to learn under extreme pressure. And I'm worried we're going to take the wrong lesson from this movie in that regard. All right. Well, anyone else? Dan, did you have any kind of thoughts on Falcon and where he's coming from there?
No, I agree. The interesting thing about that is the silent teacher, the Socratic method thing, and I think he's a great character. And I actually didn't even think about a lot of the things that Paul has thought through here. So that's good analysis.
So here's a further question then. Did he honestly believe was he honestly completely ready to let the world go? Or do you think he actually did that as a let me see if I can, this kid is obviously brilliant. He found me, he found my computer. Let me give him one more push.
At the very, very end of put in 0?
No, when they first met him?
When they're on the island and he says I won't, because I think it's very clear that he could go to NORAD and fix this. But especially because at that point, they don't think the computer is going to launch its own missiles.
Right.
It's just that everyone thinks the Russians are attacking.
Yeah.
Right. Well, how did he whistle up a helicopter in a Jeep?
Yeah, yeah.
I think they made a joke about why would you live on an island if you don't have a boat? I think the answer is because he has a helicopter.
Well, he had a pilot. He wasn't flying it.
Yeah,
he was a passenger.
So is your point maybe that he had already been planning to take care of?
My point is that he had minders, and they knew him very well. And he walked up to one of his minders, and he's like, "I do need to go to NORAD very urgently."
Okay.
Right? And they were like, "Oh, soon. Finally." Right. Okay.
But so do you think that he had already decided I should go to NORAD, but I want these kids to figure it out? Or
I think that prior to that, he had no idea that anything was happening until the kids showed up, right?
Right. No, but once they showed up, was his first reaction, I should go, but let me teach these kids a lesson real quick? Or had he completely given up on life?
To put it in the game theory, was his statement of it's okay if nuclear war happens a bluff? Or was it what he actually thought was okay?
I think he might have thought it was okay. And then when they went away and he had some time to think, he probably changed his mind.
Yeah.
Because sometimes,
I think he thought it was inevitable. I think he spent his life trying to solve, use game theory and computing to try and solve the nuclear issue, right? In some manner or another. And he felt he had failed and his family died. And he was like, I'm done with this. I'm just going to go somewhere and wait to get blown up because that's going to happen sooner or later. And then these kids show up and they're like, blah, 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 blah. And they're in his ear. And he's like, it's hopeless. It's futile. Go away. And then he's like, all right, maybe it's not. Okay, let's at least save the world for a little while.
Yeah, everything is consistent with him thinking nobody else has seemed to care ever.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And then finally, he's like, they did care.
Yeah.
Fine, I'll do it for these two.
Right. I'll do it for these two kids.
I like that a lot more than he's bluffing, because one thing I always notice as I watch this movie is I have never thought of him as a villain. I've always thought of him as kind of like a sad person who's lost hope. and the characters need to give him hope again. But then every time I watch it, I listen to him, and like he is saying that he has the power to stop a global thermonuclear war, and he's choosing not to. Like, that is normally the choice of a villain. And my only point is the fact that we can all have like understanding for why he does that and not just immediately vilify him. To me, I think that's a great part of the movie, that they kind of set that up in a way that you understand where he's coming from.
I think he doesn't think he has the power to stop it. I think he has the power he believes he has the power to delay it.
Yeah.
Only so long. And like, thus, what's the point? You know?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's where he's coming.
Which ties back to the game theory stuff we're talking about of, if you're going to have a nuclear war eventually, why not do it right now?
Why not do it now?
Well,
Rip the Band-Aid off?
That was also von Neumann's point, because von Neumann worked on the Manhattan Project, right?
Right.
And we had bombs before everybody else, and he said, "Look, they have many fewer bombs. Why don't we just launch an attack now?"
Right. Just take over the entire world, and then no one else will have bombs ever.
Well, they didn't have fusion bombs yet. He worked on the fusion bomb project too, and he was like, "We have superiority. Now's the time to launch. If we're ever going to launch, we need to launch now." And then we didn't, and then things got Cold War-ish.
See, and now
we got mad.
Now I want to both study his game theory and find out if like people in the military in the late 70s and early 80s were reading that, because that was a big part of their philosophy was nuclear war with the Russians is inevitable. Because for a while, America had a no first use policy. And that was one of the things that Reagan wanted to change, was to say like, no, like we need to be ready to use nuclear weapons first if we think it's inevitable. And if
that's the other thing game theoretically is, if you foreclose on options and then let your opponent know that you're foreclosing on certain options, like if you let your opponent know that you're never going to bet on a hand in poker that is an offsuit non-pair, right? That is giving them information, right? Like, it's probably true, but you need to be able to bluff that sometimes. And so Reagan's proposal of like, well, we need to not take options off the table is not wrong, but it's also scary.
Yeah.
Right.
When your option is kill everyone as your opening play.
Right.
Like
because game theory tells you the best way to win is to not take options off the table.
Yes.
But that only works if nuclear war is winnable.
Just for the record, not always. Sometimes a game theoretical solution will simplify to always take this one action 100% of the time, or only take these two actions as opposed to these three actions. But it does say don't eliminate the actions until you've basically solved the scenario. At which point you can say, okay, this action is dominated. We don't do that at all.
Yes, exactly.
Under optimal game theory, are you ever checking aces pre-flop?
You mean like if you're the big blind and?
Are you ever limping? Are you ever basically calling it, not raising?
Maybe
aces?
Yes, actually yes. You are, and
Bad
this
example.
this ties into like the thing that I wanted to close with.
Sure.
So if I can pivot to this quickly, to me, like machine learning and AI is obviously a part of it is about humans teaching computers to think in some way or another, right? But like what I've gained out of it is learning how to think as a human from seeing what the computers come up with, right? And so I think that's one of the things that we can, at the end of the movie, you would hope that the humans learned from Joshua just after Joshua learned from them. From them teaching it how to teach itself, then he's teaching them, don't play. Now, of course, the humans don't learn this, probably, right? That's not everybody comes across to that.
But if the U.S. learns it, it doesn't mean that Russia learns it.
Right, exactly.
Everybody
Everybody
the
has
Soviet Union
to
learned the same lesson.
Right, that's the thing. That's the thing. You need to like release a proof or something somewhere, but like.
Well, it's the open source thing again, right?
Yeah,
and I think it actually ties into something else in the movie, though, because you all were saying at the beginning that part of the idea of game theory is that theory of mind, where all those four prisoners have to trust each other. I think one of the movie implies this. It never really goes into it, but clearly part of the point is they can't just call Moscow and say, by the way, are you about to attack us?
Right.
Because Moscow could have told, like,
they said they're not, but they don't believe them.
They did. They contacted Moscow. And they said over and over, well, they say they're not launching an attack.
Right.
We're contacting them. Their
Yeah.
embassy saying that nothing's going on. There's no planes in the air.
Right. But
Right?
if they were attacking us, would they say they're attacking
They'd
us?
say the same thing.
Right. So,
Exactly.
right.
So you can't trust the poisons in that glass.
Right, exactly. Therefore, so just your aces example is, I think, a really interesting one because
Okay.
there's, without thinking about the game strategically, you might think, oh yeah, maybe I should limp aces in some spots, right? But then as humans thought about it in a very human way, and sometimes trying to use some math, but in a fairly crude way, we pretty much came around to like, yeah, you shouldn't do that. Like, you should raise them. You should always be raising, blah, blah, blah. And then we built solvers and ran the solves. And the solves are like, yeah, you can limp aces sometimes. If the stacks are small enough and, this is the situation, you actually want to limp them and then they're going to raise, then you can re-raise. Like you actually do in some scenarios want to limp re-raise, which was this human idea that then humans said, no, that can't be right. But then we built computers that say like, no, that's good. You should do that. A lot of times you shouldn't, but sometimes you can.
Right.
But then people also build models that say you're not allowed to limp. And then, then the computer won't tell you to limp because you told it can, right? And that's because the constraints that we've put on the solver, we could build the solver differently and give it different options and it would say, yeah, that's okay. But other times we'll be like, yeah, that's definitely not a thing,
Yep.
So yeah.
That makes sense. But
there are plenty of spots where it is, you don't want to be doing.
Right. No, I think it's a good last thought. And so I'll open to you also. Any other last thoughts you want to close with? Last questions you want to pose?
I'm good here.
I just want to touch once again on the opening things up. Like a lot of these situations, like the whole movie is based on nobody knowing what other people are doing, on the whole system being closed source. You can't check if they made bad assumptions.
Right.
And a lot of these problems become much more trivial when there's a lot of eyes on them. And so if you think there might be an ethical consideration, well, maybe get some other people to look at it that don't have different brains than you.
Right. Source
Yeah,
it.
that's a good way to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting, actually, parallel to what Paul was saying, because Paul, what you're kind of saying is like, the thought was we should trust the solvers, not humans. And there was kind of this back and forth. And like in this movie, the whole point is that we can't trust humans, so we should trust the computer instead. And that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, because the humans made the computer, right? So there's still like there's human bias in humans and there's human bias in computers until somehow maybe you give it enough free reign that it's like okay.
Mm-hmm.
But even then,
maybe.
Yeah. And I would just kind of say as my own last closing thing, I'm so glad we could have this discussion. I think that the ethics and AI topics are so important. The Cold War topics are so important. But also, I love this movie since I was 5 years old, so I wanted to know that it held up. And I do think that especially if you didn't grow up with some memory of the time before computers were completely ubiquitous, it might feel like this movie ages very badly, because it's just not. It's hard to imagine this kind of thing. But I do also think that, and for anybody, I think it's perfectly legitimate for anyone to like look at this movie and be like, it just seems too dated. But to me, dated or not, when I look to science fiction, the fundamental question that I often think of was, especially something like a movie, like a more accessible thing than a book. It's like books are accessible, but you know what I mean? It's 2 hours instead of a long book.
Yep.
Is that I think that it needs that the best it can be is when the ethical questions are raised by the science and the people who know the science can really enjoy it and go deep into the science. But the people who don't understand the science in the slightest can still understand it enough to perfectly understand the questions the movie's raising. And to me, it sounds like that's what this movie does, is that because none of this AI stuff I understood, especially when I was younger and watched it, but I still got exactly what the movie was trying to tell me about decision-making and war and games and when things are not a game and all that kind of stuff.
Yep. I think the movie does have many attributes that are gonna be useful for people to watch it dozens and years from now. I think there's a lot of consistent things, and I think it's going to go down as a movie in history that will have broken a lot of ground and shed new lights on these problems.
Well, and that's Dan. I actually love what you said, that how this movie was the first in a couple of things. Have you heard people in like that? You obviously not only you work in it, but like you surround yourself and you do a lot of thinking around computer science and computer science ethics. Like, is this a movie that ever gets referenced in those discussions or in terms of like these questions?
I wouldn't say it does.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a general tendency to try to put a lid on the fear that people have about machine learning because they don't understand it. I think there is a problem in our society when there are things that only a small percentage of the world population understands. One of my favorite things is quantum computing. Everybody says, "Oh, this quantum computing thing is going to be amazing," and yet it could be 100 years away from being anywhere near economically feasible. But it's a great way for physicists to get funding, right?
Right, right.
It's a cash cow for them. Blockchain, another good example of a system that, as far as does it lower the cost of transactions? Absolutely not. Is it a way for people to get attracted to people that are doing unethical things? Yes, a lot of things in the cryptocurrency market have just been an attractant for people that don't really understand what it is and are trying to position it in ways and to sell misinformation about the value of these technologies. I think there is a general optimism that machine learning is going to make our world a better place, unlike blockchain and quantum computing and cryptocurrencies, because it is helping us make better recommendations. And I think anybody who starts to see the safety aspects of self-driving cars and braking systems that will automatically brake for you if you stop paying attention to what's in front of you, we can save 30, 40, 50,000 lives a year if we can make these systems work, not under all conditions, not under rain, not in construction, not in the dark, but under ideal situations. I think we can save lives. So I think movies like this that talk about intelligence and simulations and trust of the government, right? We've lost millions of lives in the United States because we didn't trust the people in authority. And those are all important lessons to learn. And I think we still have opportunities to learn about what other countries did and why they saved so many lives because they did trust their governments. And so there's all these things that remember. The other thing to remember is this happened not long after the Vietnam War, right?
Yeah.
Where there was a huge lack of trust of our government, and so we put that into context too. And then we're still trying to undo the fact that many people in the United States don't trust our government systems and our state systems because of the history there.
Well, and we're very careful that we don't start a whole other podcast as we did last night. Because
who would do such a thing?
I know that in the context of COVID, I completely agree with those statements. But if you ask me on a general level, would I say that the problem is that people don't trust governments enough and that people need to trust authority more and trust governments more? I would say that, as you mentioned, Vietnam is a classic example of why that's absolutely not true. But just want to give that bit of pushback. But I'm now also going to be silent for a second because I think there's one person who may want to push back on something else you said. I'm not sure, but I will let that person decide.
Which about?
I wasn't sure if you. We don't want to start another podcast, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to. I wanted to give you a chance to say a word about cryptocurrency if you wanted to.
Oh no, it's all right. It's all right. I would just say, like, in terms of trust of government, like, it would be better if, there were more earned trust of government, and the problem is, like, Vietnam and Watergate and, any number of things. I mean, all the governments that were overthrown by the CIA, like, and honestly, like, all the things that the FDA and CDC had done wrong, it's like there were so many missteps that really they wouldn't have gotten the trust they deserved if they'd done everything right. But then when you also do some things wrong on top of that and undermine the trust on your own, it's like you just end up like this sort of disaster that we've ended up in.
Yeah. And also the fact of, like, I want people to have some healthy distrust of the government based
Yes.
on actual things.
Right.
Right.
Distrusting the government because you're thinking they're running a criminal conspiracy out of a pizza place, maybe not so much.
Yeah, maybe not so much with that one. Yeah.
Well,
I think skepticism more than distrust, right?
Yeah.
Sort of
Skepticism.
I think that's a
There we
very
go.
good point.
and I could just argue it back to openness. Like if they're
Yeah,
open with it,
transparency,
like
right?
yeah,
Yep, transparency is the best disinfectant, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Definitely. All right, well,
Sunlight is the best, right? UV rays? No.
yes, that's the
oh,
that's
no.
the phrase.
Sunlight.
Sunlight's
Yes,
the best.
sunlight is the best.
no.
No, I was
I
making a okay.
people as pale as me, no.
Can't you just
Anyway,
inject the
all right.
sunlight? No, that's not.
All
that's
right.
not how, okay.
Yes. All right. We're gonna wrap up though
Yeah.
now. We're really bad at wrapping up. But thank you all so much for being a part of this. For people who want to hear more of what you're all doing, Dan, you go first. If people can find kind of your writings and thoughts, where would they look?
Well, first of all, Matthew, thank you for picking this movie. This was a great movie, and I really appreciate the subtleties after listening to the team here about this thing. And the one big pitch I'm going to do is if anybody's in the Twin Cities, we're going to be doing this IoT hackathon coming up. So anybody who wants to learn how to program little devices around your house that you can talk into and make your Christmas lights change, we're having some great teams put together. So just go to LinkedIn, look for Dan McCurry, and search for IoT Hack Day. Those are some fun activities coming up in the next couple months.
Yeah, definitely check that out. Dan and I worked together for a while on like teaching computers, and I know Dan and the folks he works with are fantastic teachers. I'm a little concerned. I'm going to watch the news after the hackathon just to make sure that DEF CON levels haven't changed, but I think we're probably safe. But you say hackathon, you get a little worried.
It's
Rob,
mostly hacking Christmas tree lights. I think it's not too dangerous. So
okay, but not front doors, right?
no.
All right, Rob, what are you up to?
I'm kind of more and more social media hermit. I was recently on an episode of Good Luck High Five, another podcast that I tend to guest on a bunch, and I do a lot of magic related things, but otherwise I'm not like super public out there doing things in the public sphere.
Yeah, I will say to the rather specialized part of our audience that are judges who are coming to the Minnesota NRG conference at the end of September. Rob will be giving a presentation at part of the judge conference I'm running. That's
Cool,
probably
true.
4 out of the 1,000 or so who are going to listen to this. But, for
Right.
those 4, you still got actually applications will have closed by the time this airs. So
Fantastic.
kick rocks. Sorry. Paul, what are you up to?
Yeah, I'm Zen Madman on all the social medias that I ever go to. I actually stream on Twitch here on Zen Madman, like doing a bunch of poker solver study and stuff like that, and sometimes playing around with chess engines to see how badly I played a game of chess. And so that feels vaguely related. And yeah, I just want to say this was really fun. Thanks. I was really happy to be on and get to talk to all of you about this. Like artificial intelligence in some degree is something that I interact with a lot, right? Like on a like hundreds to thousands of hours with these programs, but it's something that I have like only passing understanding of. So it's really nice to be able to hear from some experts on it. And I do want to say just like one thing about the sort of like the dangers of AI and how this has become this like sort of bugaboo or whatever, like people, this big fear. And it's not that there's no warrant of any of that, but I think it's really interesting how this movie pairs artificial intelligence, which I think a lot of people have their concerns about, with like nuclear weapons, which I think are the single stupidest invention humans have ever created. Like the only thing they can do is kill people. And artificial intelligence, obviously, like maybe there's some things that can go wrong, but like a lot of that's human problems. But like it actually has the power to do stuff that's not killing people. So I just thought it was kind of an interesting pairing in the movie.
Yeah. And I think it's great because the last thing I wanted to close with was pointing out that like it's only a couple of years late. The whole point of this movie is the danger of letting a computer decide when to launch nuclear weapons. It's only a couple of years later that we get another movie where the fundamental fear is about a computer deciding to launch nuclear weapons, Terminator.
Yep.
Like that's exactly what that movie is about too, is AI plus nuclear weapons. So
I
hope you all
want to quote, just say that Buffy Bot
so
said,
bad.
very interesting. Thanks, guys. Pretty kitty, Rob. So I thought your kitty should get mentioned
Vale's
on
great.
the podcast as
Very,
they were
very
here
cute.
during
Very cute.
the stream.
One more good reason to tune into these streams, because kittens make very bad radio, but they make great visual. So
Exactly.
if you want to see our various pets, watch us every Wednesday night. We're going to be doing it at 7:30 Central. Figure out the rest of the times, you people and all the rest of the world. Sorry, I'm just tired.
5:30 Pacific. I got to talk to my
5:30 Pacific, 8:30 Mountain, 8:30 Eastern, and 6:30 Mountain, and the rest of the world. There's websites that'll tell you. But then, so to everyone else, thank you so much. Yeah, you really were the perfect collection of guests. Like I hadn't even really thought about how, like this movie being like about AI plus science fiction plus game theory, which are all things that all of you have interest in, but each of you has like a real expertise in some of that. And my dumb ass just asked interject Cold War history stuff. So thank you all so much. Thank you to our listeners. I really hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we enjoyed putting it together. Would love to hear your thoughts, feedback. Have you never heard about this movie? You're going to watch it now. Do you think it's ridiculous? Do you think that this is one of the best romance movies in the 80s? Because I do. I think the romance of this movie is fantastic. Not connected to this episode, but that's my thought. Rob's giving me a very skeptical look. So
Again,
we'll discuss that another time. A low bar.
Okay,
Yes, again.
fair.
A low bar. I just, 6-year-old me. But anyway, so thank you all so much. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Please send us your feedback and your thoughts, theethicalpanda.com. And most importantly, as fans, be good to each other.